welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming out tonight to celebrate the first in what we look forward to turning into a series of Paris Review events at the Strand bookstore. We're celebrating a big occasion, at least for the Paris Review today. The Strand has never carried us. They refused. I have it on good authority from Fred Bass, the owner, that he turned George Plimpton down himself. That's my predecessor. I'm Lawrence Stein. I'm the editor of the Paris Review. They've changed their minds, not a minute too soon. It's, for many of us, not just a bookstore, but it's a home away from home. And I've been coming here since my first trips to New York as a kid. I bought my first book of contemporary poetry here. I spend a lot of time in the modern library section. And to me, this place exemplifies what's great about real bookstores, because you never find the book that you actually hope to buy. It's never here, but you always walk out with something else. And in particular, I think it's an argument for the used bookstore, because you don't just see what's being pushed at you in the moment, but you get to see what's being pushed at you in the moment next to things that you hadn't known that have been sticking around for a while. So it's kind of like a walk through a graveyard, where you can sometimes find great resurrections. There are going to be three little events. First, Wallace Shawn is going to read a story by Dennis Johnson from one of our 1989 issues. Then we're going to unveil a tote bag that our readers have designed in a contest that will be sold. We're going to have a Strand Paris Review tote bag downstairs. So they're not just carrying the magazine, but they're actually going to advertise us. All is forgiven. And then we're going to have a little staging of an interview from 1950, what is it, Amy? 1956 with Dorothy Parker by Amy Warren. So without further ado, Wallace Shawn. Oh, a tiny bit more ado. I asked Wally which of his innumerable accomplishments to mention, and he said since it's a bookstore, I should point out that his last book is called Essays. It's probably for sale downstairs, and that I'd like to say that he's in the current issue. There's an interview with him, and we hope you all enjoy that. So, Wally.
So, can you hear me? This is such an incredibly successful event, at least at the beginning. Unfortunately, although I would love to hear the other events, I have to leave as soon as I've read this story. And I apologize, but that's what's going to happen. Now it's quite hard to read this because it's well, it's almost impossible. But the name of this is from the Paris Review, but also from Dennis Johnson's book, Jesus' Son. And it's called Car Crash While Hitchhiking. A salesman who shared his liquor and steered while sleeping. A Cherokee filled with bourbon. A VW, no more than a bubble of hashish fumes, captained by a college student. And a family from Marshalltown who head-oned and killed forever a man driving west out of Bethany, Missouri. I rose up sopping wet from sleeping under the pouring rain, and something less than conscious, thanks to the first three of the people I've already named, the salesman and the Indian and the student, all of whom had given me drugs. At the head of the entrance ramp, I waited without hope of a ride. What was the point even of rolling up my sleeping bag when I was too wet to be let into anybody's car? I draped it around me like a cape. The downpour raked the asphalt and gurgled in the ruts. My thoughts zoomed pitifully. The traveling salesman had fed me pills that made the linings of my veins feel scraped out. My jaw ached. I knew every raindrop by its name. I sensed everything before it happened. I knew a certain Oldsmobile would stop for me even before it slowed. And by the sweet voices of the family inside of it, I knew we'd have an accident in the storm. I didn't care. They said they'd take me all the way. The man and the wife put the little girl up front with them and left the baby in back with me and my dripping bedroll. "I'm not taking you anywhere very fast," the man said. "I've got my wife and babies here, that's why." You are the ones, I thought. And I piled my sleeping bag against the left-hand door and slept across it, not caring whether I lived or died. The baby slept free on the seat beside me. He was about 9 months old. But before any of this, that afternoon, the salesman and I had swept down into Kansas City in his luxury car. We'd developed a dangerous, cynical camaraderie, beginning in Texas, where he'd taken me on. We ate up his bottle of amphetamines, and every so often we pulled off the interstate and bought another pint of Canadian Club and a sack of ice. His car had cylindrical glass holders attached to either door and a white leathery interior. He said he'd take me home to stay overnight with his family, but first he wanted to stop and see a woman he knew. Under Midwestern clouds like great gray brains, we left the superhighway with a drifting sensation and entered Kansas City's rush hour with a sensation of running aground. As soon as we slowed down, all the magic of traveling together burned away. He went on and on about his girlfriend. "I like this girl. I think I love this girl. But I've got 2 kids and a wife, and there's certain obligations there. And on top of everything else, I love my wife. I'm gifted with love. I love my kids. I love all my relatives." As he kept on, I felt jilted and sad. "I have a boat, a little 16-footer. I have 2 cars. There's room in the backyard for a swimming pool." He found his girlfriend at work. She ran a furniture store, and I lost him there. The clouds stayed the same until night. Then, in the dark, I didn't see the storm gathering. The driver of the Volkswagen, a college man, the one who stoked my head with all the hashish, let me out beyond the city limits just as it began to rain. Never mind the speed I'd been taking, I was too overcome to stand up. I lay out in the grass off the exit ramp and woke in the middle of a puddle that had filled up around me. And later, as I've said, I slept in the back seat while the Oldsmobile, the family from Marshalltown, splashed along through the rain. And yet, I dreamed I was looking right through my eyelids, and my pulse marked off the seconds of time. The interstate through western Missouri was in that era nothing more than a 2-way road, most of it. When a semi-truck came toward us and passed going the other way, we were lost in a blinding spray and a warfare of noises such as you get being towed through an automatic car wash. The wipers stood up and lay down across the windshield without much effect. I was exhausted, and after an hour I slept more deeply. I'd known all along exactly what was going to happen, but the man and his wife woke me up later, denying it viciously. Oh, no! No! I was thrown against the back of their seat so hard that it broke. I commenced bouncing back and forth. A liquid which I knew right away was human blood flew around the car and rained down on my head. When it was over, I was in the back seat again, just as I had been. I raised up and looked around. Our headlights had gone out. The radiator was hissing steadily. Beyond that, I didn't hear a thing. As far as I could tell, I was the only one conscious. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that the baby was lying on its back beside me as if nothing had happened. Its eyes were open, and it was feeling its cheeks with its little hands. In a minute, the driver, who'd been slumped over the wheel, sat up and peered over at us. His face was smashed and dark with blood. It made my teeth hurt to look at him. But when he spoke, it didn't sound as if any of his teeth were broken. What happened? We had a wreck, he said. The baby's okay, I said, although I had no idea how the baby was. He turned to his wife. Janice, he said. Janice! Janice! Is she okay? She's dead, he said, shaking her angrily. No, she's not. I was ready to deny everything myself now. Their little girl was alive, but knocked out. She whimpered in her sleep. But the man went on shaking his wife. Janice, he hollered. His wife moaned. She's not dead, I said, clambering from their car and turning away. She won't wake up, I heard him say. I was standing out here in the night with the baby for some reason in my arms. It must have been still raining, but I remember nothing about the weather. We collided with another car on what I now perceived was a 2-lane bridge. The water beneath us was invisible in the dark. Moving toward the other car, I began to hear rasping metallic snores. Somebody was flung halfway out the passenger door, which was open, in the posture of one hanging from a trapeze by his ankles. The car had been broadsided, smashed so flat that no room was left inside of it, even for this person's legs, to say nothing of a driver or any other passengers. I just walked right on past. Headlights were coming from far off. I made for the head of the bridge, waving them to stop with one arm and clutching the baby to my shoulder with the other. It was a big semi, grinding its gears as it decelerated. The driver rolled down his window, and I shouted up at him, "There's a wreck! Go for help!" "I can't turn around here," he said. He let me and the baby up on the passenger side, and we just sat there in the cab, looking at the wreckage in his headlights. "Is everybody dead?" he asked. "I can't tell who is and who isn't," I admitted. He poured himself a cup of coffee from a thermos and switched off all but his parking lights. "What time is it?" "Oh, it's around 3:15, he said. By his manner, he seemed to endorse the idea of not doing anything about this. I was relieved and tearful. I thought something was required of me, but I hadn't wanted to find out what it was. When another car showed, coming the opposite direction, I thought I should talk to them. "Can you keep the baby?" I asked the truck driver. "You'd better hang on to him," the driver said. "It's a boy, isn't it?" "Well, I think so," I said. The man hanging out of the wrecked car was still alive as I passed, and I stopped, grown a little more used to the idea now of how really badly broken he was, and made sure there was nothing I could do. He was snoring loudly and rudely. His blood bubbled out of his mouth with every breath. He wouldn't be taking many more. I knew that, but he didn't. And therefore I looked down into the great pity of a person's life on this earth. I don't mean that we all end up dead. That's not the great pity. I mean that he couldn't tell me what he was dreaming, and I couldn't tell him what was real. Before too long, there were cars backed up for a ways at either end of the bridge and headlights giving a night game atmosphere to the steaming rubble, and ambulances and cop cars nudging through so that the air pulsed with color. I didn't talk to anyone. My secret was that in this short while, I'd gone from being the president of this tragedy to being a faceless onlooker at a gory wreck. At some point, an officer learned that I was one of the passengers and took my statement. I don't remember any of this, except that he told me, "Put out your cigarette." We paused in our conversation to watch the dying man being loaded into the ambulance. He was still alive, still dreaming obscenely. The blood ran off of him in strings. His knees jerked and his head rattled. There was nothing wrong with me, and I hadn't seen anything, but the policeman had to question me and take me to the hospital anyway. The word came over his car radio that the man was now dead, just as we came under the awning of the emergency room entrance. I stood in a tiled corridor with my wet sleeping bag bunched against the wall beside me, talking to a man from the local funeral home. The doctor stopped to tell me I'd better have an x-ray. No. Now would be the time. If something turns up later, there's nothing wrong with me. Down the hall came the wife. She was glorious, burning. She didn't know yet that her husband was dead. We knew. That's what gave her such power over us. The doctor took her into a room with a desk at the end of the hall, and from under the closed door, a slab of brilliance radiated, as if by some stupendous process, diamonds were being incinerated in there. What a pair of lungs! She shrieked as I imagined an eagle would shriek. It felt wonderful to be alive to hear it. I've gone looking for that feeling everywhere. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm surprised I let those words out, but it's always been my tendency to lie to doctors, as if good health consisted only of the ability to fool them. Some years later, one time when I was admitted to the detox at Seattle General Hospital, I took the same tack. "Are you hearing unusual sounds or voices?" the doctor asked. "Help us, oh God, it hurts," the boxes of cotton screamed. "Not exactly," I said. "Not exactly," he said. Now, what does that mean? "I'm not ready to go into all that," I said. A yellow bird fluttered close to my face, and my muscles grabbed. Now I was flopping like a fish. When I squeezed shut my eyes, hot tears exploded from the sockets. When I opened them, I was on my stomach. "How did the room get so white?" I asked. A beautiful nurse was touching my skin. "These are vitamins," she said, and drove the needle in. It was raining. Gigantic ferns leaned over us. The forest drifted down a hill. I could hear a creek rushing down among rocks. And you ridiculous people, you expect me to help you. Thank you.
That's the worst choice of an opening act ever. That's a terrible story. I'd forgotten how bad it is. Thank you, Wally. Let's get that out of our heads. Where's our tote bag mock-up? Do we have it? No, she's not here. To receive the tote bag mock-up, Jessica Strand, the woman who's put all this together. This is one of many very good designs that we got. The designer is named Roke Strew. Very good name, Roke Strew. I don't know anything else about him. Ta-da! So that's the Paris Review Hadada, our mascot, and that's the Strand oval. And the rest is self-explanatory. Amy Warren, who's going to be playing Dorothy Parker in a minute, has been in Adding Machine, a musical, August Osage County, Boardwalk Empire, and she's about to be in a new musical by Todd Allman and Sarah Rule called, what's it called? Melancholy Flight. And she's also on The Truth, Movies for Your Ears, which is the most downloaded podcast in the English-speaking world. That means you can go and listen to it for free. And her interviewer is going to be played by our deputy editor, Sadie Stein. Where's Sadie? They're about to come out. So please welcome them so they do come out.
Good evening.
Your first job was on Vogue, wasn't it? How did you go about getting hired, and why Vogue?
After my father died, there wasn't any money. I had to work, you see, and Mr. Crowningshield, God rest his soul, paid $12 for a small verse of mine and gave me a job at $10 a week. Well, I thought I was Edith Sitwell. I lived in a boarding house at 103rd and Broadway, paying $8 a week for my room and 2 meals, breakfast and dinner. Thorne Smith was there, and another man. Oh, we used to sit around in the evenings and talk. And there was no money, but Jesus, we had fun.
What kind of work did you do at Vogue?
I wrote captions. This little pink dress will win you a beau, that sort of thing. Funny, there were plain women working at Vogue, not chic. They were decent, nice women, the nicest women I ever met. But they had no business on such a magazine. They wore funny little bonnets, and in the pages of their magazine, they virginized the models from tough babes into exquisite little loves. Now the editors are what they should be, all chic and worldly. Most of the models are out of the mind of a Bram Stoker. And as for the caption writers, my old job, they're recommending mink covers at $75 a piece for the wooden ends of golf clubs. Oh, for the friend who has everything. Civilization is coming to an end, you understand.
Why did you change to Vanity Fair?
Mr. Crowningshield wanted me to. Mr. Sherwood and Mr. Benchley, we always called each other by our last names, were there. Our office was across from the Hippodrome. The midgets would come out and frighten Mr. Sherwood. He was about 7 feet tall, and they were always sneaking up behind him and asking him how the weather was up there. Walk down the street with me, he'd ask, and Mr. Benchley and I would leave our jobs and guide him down the street. Well, I can't tell you, we had more fun. Both Mr. Benchley and I subscribed to 2 undertaking magazines, The Casket and Sunnyside. Steel yourself. Sunnyside had a joke column called From Grave to Gay. I cut a picture out of one of them in color of how and where to inject embalming fluid, and had it hung over my desk until Mr. Crowningshield asked me if I could possibly take it down. Mr. Crowningshield was a lovely man, but puzzled. I must say, we behaved extremely badly. Albert Lee, one of the editors, had a map over his desk with little flags on it to show where our troops were fighting during the First World War. Every day, he would get the news and move the flags around. Now, I was married, my husband was overseas, and since I didn't have anything better to do, I'd get up a half an hour early and go down and change his flags. And later on, Lee would come in and look at his map, and he'd get very serious about spies, shout, and spend his morning moving his little pins back into position.
Now, how long did you stay at Vanity Fair?
4 years. I'd taken over the drama criticism from P.G. Wodehouse. Then I fixed 3 plays, one of them Caesar's Wife with Billy Burke in it, and as a result, I was fired.
You fixed 3 plays?
Well, panned. The plays closed, and the producers, who were the big boys, Dillingham, Ziegfeld, Belasco, didn't like it, you know. Vanity Fair was a magazine of no opinion, but I had opinions. So I was fired. Mr. Sherwood and Mr. Benchley resigned their jobs. It was all right for Mr. Sherwood, but Mr. Benchley had a family, 2 children. It was the greatest act of friendship I'd known. Mr. Benchley did a sign, "Contributions for Miss Billy Burke." And on our way out, we left it in the hall of Vanity Fair. We behaved very badly. We made ourselves discharge chevrons and wore them.
Now, where did you all go after Vanity Fair?
Mr. Sherwood became a motion picture critic for the old Life. Mr. Benchley did the drama reviews. He and I had an office so tiny that an inch smaller and it would have been adultery. We had Park Bench for a cable address, but no one ever sent us one. It was so long ago, before you were a gleam in someone's eyes, that I doubt there was a cable.
Now, it's a popular supposition that there was much more communication between writers in the 20s. The roundtable discussions in the Algonquin, for example.
Yeah, I wasn't there very often. It cost too much. Others went. Kaufman was there. I guess he was sort of funny. Mr. Benchley and Mr. Sherwood went when they had a nickel. Franklin P. Adams, whose column was widely read by people who wanted to write, would sit in occasionally. And Harold Ross, the New Yorker editor. He was a professional lunatic. I don't know if he was a great man. He had a profound ignorance. On one of Mr. Benchley's manuscripts, he wrote in the margin opposite Andromache, "Who he?" Mr. Benchley wrote back, "You keep out of this." The only one with stature who came to the round table was Haywood Broun.
What was it about the 20s that inspired people like yourself and Broun?
Gertrude Stein did us the most harm when she said, "You're all a lost generation." Well, that got around to certain people, and we all said, we're lost. Perhaps it suddenly brought us to the sense of change or irresponsibility. But don't forget that though the people in the 20s seemed like flops, they weren't. Fitzgerald, the rest of them, reckless as they were, drinkers as they were, they worked damn hard and all the time.
Did the lost generation attitude you speak of have a detrimental effect on your own work?
It's silly to blame it on dates, but so it happened to be. Oh, damn it, it was the 20s and we had to be smarty. I wanted to be cute. That's the terrible thing. I should have had more sense.
And during this time you were writing poems?
Yeah, my verses. I cannot say poems. Like everybody was then, I was following in the exquisite footsteps of Miss Millay, unhappily in my own horrible sneakers. My verses are no damn good. Let's face it, honey. My verse is terribly dated. As anything once fashionable is dreadful now. I gave it up knowing it wasn't getting any better, but nobody seemed to notice my magnificent gesture.
Well, do you think your verse writing has been of any benefit to your prose?
Franklin P. Adams once gave me a book of French verse forms and told me to copy their design, that by copying them I would get precision in prose. The men you imitate in verse influence your prose, and what I got out of it was precision, all I realized I ever had in prose writing.
Now, how did you get started in writing?
I fell into writing, I suppose, being one of those awful children who wrote verses. I went to a convent in New York, the Blessed Sacrament. Convents do the same things progressive schools do, only they don't know it. They don't teach you how to read. You have to find out for yourself. In my convent, we did have a textbook, one that devoted a page and a half to Adelaide Ann Proctor. But we couldn't read Dickens. He was vulgar, you know. But I read him and Thackeray, and I'm the one woman you'll ever know who's read every word of Charles Reade, the author of The Cloister and the Hearth. But as for helping me in the outside world, the convent taught me only that if you spit on a pencil eraser, it will erase ink. And I remember the smell of oilcloth and the smell of nun's garb. I was fired from there, finally, for a lot of things. Among them, my insistence that the Immaculate Conception was spontaneous combustion.
Now, have you ever drawn from those years for story material?
Oh, all those writers who write about their childhood. Gentle God, if I wrote about my childhood, you wouldn't sit in the same room with me.
What then would you say is the source of most of your work?
Need of money, dear.
Well, could I ask you some technical questions? How do you actually write out a story? Do you write out a draft and then go over it, or what?
It takes me 6 months to do a story. I think it out and then write it sentence by sentence. No first draft. I can't write 5 words, but that I change 7.
And how do you name your characters?
The telephone book and from obituary columns.
Do you keep a notebook?
I tried to keep one, but I never could remember where I put the damn thing. I always say I'm going to keep one tomorrow.
Now, how do you get the story down on paper?
I wrote in longhand at first, but I've lost it. I used 2 fingers on the typewriter. I think it's unkind of you to ask. I know so little about the typewriter that once I bought a new one because I couldn't change the ribbon on the one I had.
Well, you're working on a play now, aren't you?
Yes, collaborating with Arnaud Dussault. I'd like to do a play more than anything. First night is the most exciting thing in the world. It's wonderful to hear your words spoken. Unhappily, our first play, The Ladies of the Corridor, was not a success, but writing that play was the best time I ever had, both for the privilege and the stimulation of working with Mr. Dussault, and because that play was the only thing I have ever done which I had great pride.
How about the novel? Have you ever tried that form?
I wish to God I could do one, but I haven't got the nerve.
And short stories, are you still doing them?
I'm trying now to do a story that's purely narrative. I think narrative stories are the best, though my past stories make themselves stories by telling themselves through what people say. I haven't got a visual mind. I hear things. I'm not going to do those he said, she said things anymore. They're over, honey, they're over. I want to do a story that can be told only in the narrative form, and though they're going to scream about the rent, I am going to do it.
Do you think economic security an advantage to the writer?
Yes. Being in a garret doesn't do you any good unless you're some sort of Keats. The people who lived and wrote well in the 20s were comfortable and easy living. They were able to find stories and novels, and good ones, in conflict that came out of $2 million a year, not a garret. As for me, I'd like to have money, and I'd like to be a good writer. These 2 things can come together, and I hope they will, but if that's too adorable, I'd rather have money. I hate almost all rich people, and I think I'd be darling at it, though. At the moment, however, I like to think of Maurice Baring's remark, "If you would know what the Lord God thinks of money, you have only to look at those to whom he gives it." I realize that's not much help when the wolves come scratching at the door, but it's comfort.
Well, what do you think about the artists being supported by the state?
Well, naturally, when penniless, I think it's superb. I think that the art of the country so immeasurably adds to its prestige that if you want the country to have writers and artists, persons who live precariously in our country, the state must help. I do not think that any kind of artist thrives under charity, by which I mean one person or organization giving him money, here and there, this and that. That's no good. The difference between the state giving and the individual patron is that one is charity and the other isn't. Charity is murder, and you know it. But I do think that if the government supports its artists, they need have no feeling of gratitude, the meanest and most sniveling attribute in the world, or baskets being brought to them, or apple polishing. Working for the state, for Christ's sake. Are you grateful to your employers? Let the state see what its artists are trying to do, like France with the Académie Française. The artists are part of their country, and their country should recognize this. So both it and the artists can take pride in their efforts. Now, I mean that, dear.
How about Hollywood as provider for the artist?
Hollywood isn't money. It's congealed snow, melts in your hand, and there you are. I can't talk about Hollywood. It was a horror to me when I was there, and it's a horror to look back on. I can't imagine how I got through it. When I got away from it, I couldn't even refer to the place by name. Out there, I called it. And you want to know what out there means to me? Once I was coming down a street in Beverly Hills, and I saw a Cadillac about a block long, and out of the side window was a wonderfully slinky mink, and an arm, and at the end of the arm a hand in a white suede glove wrinkled round the wrist, and in the hand was a bagel with a bite out of it.
Do you think Hollywood destroys the artist's talent?
No. I think nobody on earth writes down. Garbage though they turn out, Hollywood writers aren't writing down. That is their best. If you're going to write, don't pretend to write down. It's going to be the best you can do, and it's the fact that it's the best you can do that kills you. I want so much to write well, though I know I don't, and that I didn't make it. But during and at the end of my life, I will adore those who have.
Then what is it that's the evil in Hollywood?
It's the people, like the director who put his finger in Scott Fitzgerald's face and complained, "Pay you while you ought to pay us." It was terrible about Scott. If you'd seen him, you'd have been sick. When he died, no one went to the funeral. Not a single soul came or even sent a flower. I said, "Poor son of a bitch," a quote right out of The Great Gatsby, and everyone thought it was another wisecrack, but I said it in dead seriousness. Sickening about Scott. And it wasn't only the people, but also the indignity to which your ability was put. There was a picture in which Mr. Benchley had a part. In it, Monty Woolley had a scene in which he had to enter a room through a door on which was balanced a bucket of water. He came into the room covered with water and muttered to Mr. Benchley, who had a part in the scene, Benchley of Harvard?" "Yes," mumbled Mr. Benchley, and he asked, Woolley of Yale?"
How about your political views? Have they made any difference to you professionally?
Well, certainly. I don't think this blacklist business extends to the theater or certain of the magazines. In Hollywood, it exists because several gentlemen felt it best to drop names like marbles, which bounced back like rubber balls, about people they'd seen in the company of what they charmingly call commies. You can't go back 30 years to Sacco and Vanzetti. I won't do it. Well. That's the way it is. If all this means something to the good of the movies, I don't know what it is. Sam Goldwyn said, "How am I going to do decent pictures when all my good writers are in jail?" And then he added, the infallible Goldwyn, "Don't misunderstand me, they all ought to be hung." Mr. Goldwyn didn't know about hanged. And that's all there is to say. It's not the tragedies that kill us, it's the messes. I can't stand messes. I'm not being a smart cracker. You know I'm not when you meet me, don't you, honey?